The idea, if you want to think about what had changed that made this new, that made all this mass surveillance interesting and novel, was it was proactive surveillance. Historically, people go, "Oh, why'd you work for the NSA if you have problems with surveillance?" Right? Well, the idea is, once upon a time, if you think back to Cold War histories, or at least propaganda, we in the West distinguished ourselves from, the traditional adversary nations, the Stasi and the KGB, the secret police skulking around, by saying we don't do that. We're different from the Iron Curtain. We could do that. We could spy on our own people internally, and we could spy on people who have done nothing wrong. We could do it better than them. We have better technology. We have greater budgets. We have, more genius, whatever. We're the shining city on the hill. But we don't. Because it's wrong. It's contrary to our rights, it's contrary to our laws, it's contrary to our values. This is exactly the opposite of what we were trying to build. And so we performed retrospective surveillance rather than prospective surveillance. We would wait until someone came to our attention. 3rd Division of the Missile Corps, or some general sitting behind a desk, or someone we suspect of being a spy or a terrorist, or we think this person is a kidnapper. We get their phone number, we see where they work, we go, this is the battalion to which they're attached. And then we begin monitoring that line. We begin monitoring that frequency. We begin monitoring that channel. We begin monitoring that patch of Earth from satellites. The important concepts to understand here is that the targeting was largely done on a very individualized basis. And it was done after a suspicion had been developed, a suspicion of wrongdoing, right, or some kind of oppositional activity. After September 11th, the policies of the United States changed. Now, it's interesting and very historically important to understand that this plan for this new system of mass surveillance was not created in the wake of 9/11. In fact, it had already been written. The U.S. Patriot Act, you all may have potentially heard of, which really changed the way our surveillance and sort of counterterrorism strategies worked, had been sitting on a shelf for years, ready to go. But our legislature didn't believe they were in a position where they could pass it. There wasn't that kind of support. But after the entire nation had been victimized, everyone was grieving and angry and fearful, it passed with, I think, only a single dissenting vote. And now we live in this new world, right? And the program started slowly, and they started intensely secretly. The author of the Patriot Act, since 2013, has said he did not believe, it was not his intent and it was not his understanding that the Patriot Act or any of the laws passed since then authorized these activities at all. But the intelligence agencies secretly interpreted laws in such a way that they believed that they did. And they didn't need to inform the full body of our legislature about that. We have 535 members in our legislature that are sort of our public representatives. Instead, they told only 8. These are called famously the Gang of 8. These are the most senior members of both the Senate and the House in the United States, sort of our 2 chambers, the upper and lower house, if you will, which would be the ranking members of the majority and minority party for both houses, and then the ranking members of the majority and minority party sitting on the 2 intelligence committees, 1 in each house, right? And the judgment of these 8 people alone, not even really the judgment because they're just giving them a notification, it's the executive who's chopping off on this, was substituted for everyone else in the Congress and everyone else in the nation. We were never granted an explicit vote on this. We were not allowed to challenge these things in court. Whenever we got court cases or any kind of evidence or newspaper reports that indicated this kind of activity was happening, the government would say, we can neither confirm nor deny these activities are occurring. And as a result of this, you can't challenge it in court because you can't prove it. And if you can prove it, it's a state secret. And if it is a state secret, the court can't rule on the matter, because to make the government defend it is to make the government admit it, and that by itself is harming the national security. And the court can't even judge whether or not it is harming national security under the US system, because they say the branch best positioned to judge matters of national security is the executive, who, if these programs were not harming national security, would have committed the gravest criminal and constitutional violations and probably in the modern history of the country. And so you can see how it forms a system of incentives that paralyzes the body of oversight, right? And it was only over a very long period of years and years and years that stuff started to come out in bits and pieces. But even I, who had worked as a staff officer of the United States government undercover for the CIA positioned overseas, and then later as a contractor for the NSA, working in government facilities, taking orders from government personnel, working on government equipment, literally pressing the buttons and using the tools of mass surveillance directly with my own two hands, but working for a private company, because in the United States that's just how we do it. Even I didn't know what was happening until that very end part of my career, when my access had grown so broad and my clearances so deep that I could see the whole of the picture. And I stumbled across a document. It was one of those Inspector General's reports that was written in response to a newspaper story all the way back in 2006. And this was a New York Times journalist by the name of James Risen, had found evidence and someone who was willing to talk to him in government to say, look, the United States government is engaged in mass surveillance. And they're saying this is a counterterrorism program, but it's collecting domestic US persons' communications. And this was a clear, just absolute violation of the law at the time. Even with the Patriot Act, they had simply gone too far. There was no way to defend this beyond political arguments. And this story was ready to go and ready to be printed just 1 month before the US election, George Bush's re-election, if you remember that name. It's ancient history now, but not such a wonderful fellow. And what happened was the newspaper reporter had the story cold. Everybody knew it was true. The government had quietly admitted to it. The editor-in-chief of the New York Times, which is, the biggest newspaper in the United States, was called by the White House. And I believe actually he had a meeting with George Bush, the president himself. And he said, if you run this story, people will die. You'll have blood on your hands. These programs will be ineffective. The next buildings are going to come down, and it's going to be your fault because these programs are saving lives every day. And if we lose them, if they lose their effectiveness, we'll have nothing. We'll be open, we'll be vulnerable. And he believed it. And he spiked the story. And George Bush was reelected by the slimmest margin in nearly any presidential election history, possibly the slimmest. I just can't remember the exact numbers. And then in 2006, the reporter whose story was killed writes a book. And the New York Times hears about it, and they realize their reporter is about to print the story they would not. And that would be extraordinarily embarrassing, so they print it. And it becomes a massive scandal, a warrantless wiretapping scandal of the Bush administration. It leads to changes in our laws. They instantly passed a stopgap measure, an emergency law, that should have warned everybody something terrible was about to happen, because it was called the Protect America Act. And whenever you see a bill with a name like that, you should be skeptical of it. But sure enough, it passed. And one of the interesting things about that law and the law that replaced it, the FISA Amendments Act of 2008, is that it retroactively immunized all of the corporate partners in the telecommunications industry, the ones who our phone calls transit over, that had been happening or that had been violating the law plainly because they were operating only on the basis of a letter from the US government saying, will you pretty please do this? Even though their corporate lawyers said it's illegal if we do this.